I'm talking today to Andrew Feinstein, the author of After the Party, a book about the arms scandal in South Africa, and his latest book, The Shadow World, which is about arms dealers globally. How did you get involved in politics in South Africa during the apartheid years, and why?
I was always, from a very young age, very politically engaged for some reason. Even when we lived in Vienna for times, I was very interested in politics there. A very charismatic politician by the name of Bruno Kreisky was the Chancellor or Prime Minister for almost 20 years, a Social Democrat. And South Africa just seemed strange to me. The politics, the social fabric of the society seemed odd. And my parents were very liberal, so spoke about politics quite a lot. And in my late teens, I got involved with a welfare agency at the University of Cape Town in my first year, which worked a lot in a huge squatter settlement just outside Cape Town, Crossroads. And I started working there. And that's where I really cut my political teeth and where I was first introduced to people who were underground members of the ANC. And it was then that I realized that the ANC really represented the aspirations of the majority of South Africans during the apartheid years.
And you were on the team for the negotiations at the end of apartheid. Why did the national government enter into those negotiations at this point? What was the crunch for them?
I was part of the facilitating team that was set up by something called the Consultative Business Movement. It must be one of the few negotiations that has been negotiated by an entity supported by the business community. It was remarkable. I think that the National Party, the party of apartheid, had been forced into a corner. Economically, things were not great. A group of banks decided not to roll over South Africa's debt in the mid-80s, which I think was a crucial turning point. The South African Defence Force had suffered a heavy military defeat in Angola at a place called Kuto Kunavale, mainly at the hands of the Cubans, which I think undermined South Africa's sort of strategy of creating a band of moderate African states around it. Exactly. Yeah. And also, obviously, the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think F.W. de Klerk thought that this was perhaps an opportunity where the ANC had lost one of its biggest backers and lost its ideological ballast. And I think that's why he went that route. I think he realized that apartheid was unsustainable at all these different levels, and felt that there was a willing negotiator in Nelson Mandela.
What were the sticking points during that process of facilitating the negotiations?
There were a number. There were technical sticking points, so issues like the extent of federalism in the new order. The National Party and some of its more moderate supporters, the Inkatha Freedom Party, favoured a very strong federal model. The ANC initially was totally opposed to any form of federalism, but actually compromised substantially, leading to the creation of 9 provinces with a number of powers in South Africa. Then there was another, I think, quite interesting sticking point, which was what was described at the time as black-on-black violence, which was really violence between the ANC and the Inkatha Freedom Party. And there was one extraordinary moment in the negotiations at the World Trade Center, just outside Johannesburg International Airport, this big warehouse-type structure where we were meeting, where F.W. de Klerk and Nelson Mandela were due to address the media, diplomats, and the 30-odd parties involved in the negotiations. And F.W. de Klerk was sitting on the stage waiting for Mandela, who hadn't arrived. And Mandela arrived late, which was very unusual for him, and stormed onto the stage. And he didn't wait for any of the pleasantries. He simply stood up and he said, "I now have incontrovertible evidence that you," pointing at F.W. de Klerk, "have been involved through your security forces in instigating this black-on-black violence. I thought that I could trust you. I thought that you were an honourable negotiator. I don't believe that anymore," is effectively what he said. And he literally stormed off the stage, out of the World Trade Center and out of negotiations. And it took months and months of enormous behind-the-scenes activity to get the negotiations back on track. And that was the one moment where I thought we might not get to the promised land of a non-racial democracy.
And what had to happen in order, very briefly, what had to happen in order for him to feel he was comfortable coming back?
I think that the National Party had to accept that it was playing a double game, as was, interestingly, the ANC. The ANC had kept in place an underground structure in case things went wrong in the negotiations, which nobody knew about at that time. But the National Party had to effectively put a whole lot of controls over the security forces. So, for instance, I was not only facilitating the national negotiations, but also a lot of local processes. And in one in particular, in an area south of Johannesburg, the Vaal Triangle, they had to agree that the local township communities would, in a sense, co-govern the area together with the National Party appointed administrator who was really just a front man for the security forces. So there was this sort of almost cooperative governance for a period of time. And I think that's what got the negotiations.
A sort of dual power structure.
Pretty much.
And you were selected to become a candidate in South Africa's first genuinely democratic elections in the PWV, the Pretoria Witsbuitersrand-Vereniging, for the provincial government elections.
Yeah.
What was it like to be in the first election?
Oh, it was extraordinary. It was, at some levels we didn't know what we were doing. I mean, I remember I had a little house in Melville, a suburb of Johannesburg, and my brother-in-law and a friend of his from London came out to run my little election office from a shed in our garden.
Right.
It really was a quite ramshackle operation. Obviously, we were in a white area where we weren't expected to garner huge numbers of votes. But we wanted to use it as an opportunity not only to engage with domestic workers who now had a vote for the first time, but also with white South Africans, many of whom were very apprehensive about the change. And I think we probably spent more time doing that than actual electioneering. But it was fascinating. We had sort of the first mobile phones to arrive in South Africa, which were these huge brick-like things that, as soon as you went into a dip, they didn't work. But there was just, everywhere you went, there was this feeling of extraordinary excitement and anticipation. And people were just sort of mucking in. I'll never forget, on the day of the election, April 1994, at one of the counting stations at a school in my area, the ANC person who was overseeing the count for us was this remarkable economist who I had known, having studied economics myself, who went on to become the Director General of Finance, is now married to our former Finance Minister Trevor Manuel, and is now Executive Chair of the biggest banking group in South Africa. And there she was, making sure that the votes were being counted okay. And that was really the spirit of it. It was a moment at which I think for the first time many of us actually felt equal and felt we were all participating in something, that we all had something to contribute, whatever our status had been historically. And it was something that I will never experience again. It really was a once-in-a-lifetime experience.
And how did the internal political culture of the ANC work, going from one thing to another, as it were? Because it's a very strange beast. It's a mixture of
it really
Communist Party members and an elite trained in Moscow.
Yeah.
And
it's an incredibly broad church.
Yes.
You have the exiles, many of whom, as you say, were trained in the former Soviet Union, some of whom studied here. In Cuba, there was a lot of ANC members spent time in Cuba. There were the Robben Islanders, Nelson Mandela and the people around him, Ahmed Kathrada, Walter Sisulu, are some of the names that people might recall, who were really an extraordinary group of people with a sense of selflessness that I have never come across in a group of human beings, which they obviously learned over time, spending over 2 decades in jail together. And then there were the internal people who had stayed in South Africa, creating something called the United Democratic Movement. The United Democratic Front, the UDF. And there were some tensions between these three groups initially. They had very different political cultures, and there were clashes. But pretty soon, I think it became something of a melting pot, where your allegiance to any of these three groups started to loosen, and other bonds were formed, usually around matters of mutual interest in the here and now, getting onto an election, a candidate's list for the election. Then post that, pushing for certain economic policies, certain social policies, whatever the case may be. So it was an incredibly fluid time in terms of the political culture, but it was a time dominated by Mandela, and I say that in the sense that the key issues were reconciliation, the national interest above party interest, and a sense of selflessness. And this was expected both of privileged South Africans who'd benefited from apartheid and those who'd struggled for many decades against apartheid, who now, some of whom felt this was their moment and they were entitled now.
Yeah.
But I think for those, immediately after the election, there was really a sense of selflessness. We would work the most absurd hours. I mean, I was doing 3 jobs that were completely unconstitutional. I was a member of parliament where I chaired an economics and finance committee in the Gauteng legislature. I was also effectively setting up a treasury and a department of economic affairs, and I was acting as economic advisor to the provincial premier Tokyo Sexwale and his finance minister Jabu Moleketi. So I was the check and balance on the very people I was advising and over the department that myself and a colleague were setting up. So it was incredibly fluid, but again, very exciting. And what struck me undoubtedly was the sense of selflessness that was characterised, where the national interest was paramount.
And how did the ANC get from being, again, a fairly kind of party of the left, effectively, to having really a fairly conventional view of finance?
It's quite an interesting thing. The ANC, I mean, sections of the ANC were of the left, obviously the Communist Party. Where you had someone like a Joe Slovo, whose background wasn't dissimilar to my own family's, in that his family came from Lithuania, Latvia, and were imbued with communism as a way out of the Tsarist pogroms. But there were also a lot of moderates, a lot of sort of middle-class moderates who in any normal society would not have been political activists. They would have been lawyers, doctors, whatever.
Yes. But even the Joe Slovos made the journey, didn't they?
Well, to some extent. There were some who never really did, and there still are, actually. But the vast majority, and certainly the key leaders, and I would say here Thabo Mbeki was the crucial figure. There was a realization through a lot of engagement with political leaders from other countries, particularly in the Scandinavian countries, who had also been very supportive of the ANC, along with the former Soviet Union. Engagement with multilateral institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, about certain of the realities of being a small, open economy in a very challenging global economy. And I think very quickly people like Mbeki, Trevor Manuel, who became the first post-apartheid, the first really ANC-appointed finance minister. We had sort of a couple of interim people before him. They understood that the fiscal situation we inherited was a mess. I mean, I think we had a deficit of 14% of GDP or something like that. It was huge. Our foreign exchange reserves were tiny. We've been paying premiums for all of the obvious things, oil, etc., keeping our economy back. And they realized we were going to have to sort that out before we were able to think about any sort of socio-economic
redistribution of wealth.
Redistribution, absolutely. Yeah. And that was really the sea change. But it is a debate and a strategy that has never been fully accepted by everyone in the ANC. It continues to be a point of some conflict within this broad church of ideologies and economic viewpoints.